Okay, so for this session, as with previous parts of the workshop, you can find all the code of it on my GitHub. So you can just open GitHub like so and navigate to the Just Javascript repository, and this will give you a link to basically you can download the finished code for this app right here. So all we will be covering today, it's already fully complete here. So if you ever have questions, you can just download it from this URL on my GitHub repository. And the final app, which we will build today, looks a bit like this. So it's going to be something like this. We have a very basic standard view where our dashboard looks a bit like this. It's going to give us, if we're not logged in or logged in, it gives us the option to sign up for an account via the login or the sign up page. In this scenario, I already have an account created, so it's going to be something like this. And basically that allows me to just create nodes like this test node I created. I can create new ones, I can click on nodes, I can see the node details, I can edit nodes, and from the dashboard I can also delete nodes like so. So that's basically what we're going to be doing today. So let's get started. And the first things first, right now what I'm beginning with is a completely blank. Basically I have no front end for this app whatsoever. This is the fully finished backend for my Just Jotted front end, and I'm going to build my front end around the backend API. So first things first, I have to create my public folder, which you might already have. So I'm just going to create this public folder. I already have wired up inside my server.js that I do need to have my route redirection to server. So as you can see in my server.js, there is a specific piece of middleware here. Let me just give me 1 sec to get rid of this. There we go. So basically in this line 28, this is what's allowing us to basically redirect calls from public into the client. So anything we save inside of public can be accessed by the URL directly. So for example, if thanks to this line of code I have right here, I can just create maybe a test page like so. So test.html, save it, enter some random content like so. I guess that doesn't work. I have no idea what that, there you go, that works. So if I just write test page and test page content and save this, after I restart my server, which is going to be like so, so I'm just gonna open my terminal here. Let's open our terminal, let's type npm start. We should be able to access our test page. Oh, hang on a sec, I forgot to install all dependencies. Just give me 1 sec to do that right now. It's because I downloaded the blank project, so no node module dependencies, but those are quick to install. In the meantime, everything looks to be about right. Let me just verify something really quick while that's going on. In the meantime, let's verify the server is truly shut down right now. Yep, that's shut down. Let's wait for this to finish installing super quick. There we go. So that's fully installed. Now let's start our server like so. Just gotta wait it a while because it needs to connect to MongoDB and so on. And that should be started right about now. There we go, that's started. Let's try opening the URL localhost 8080. Notice how right now we get the error not found because we haven't created a default route on public. So if we try to access the file we just created, test.html, notice how that works. So let's create a default page that gets loaded whenever you load this page. So that's going to be our index.html. If I go to my public folder, create a new index.html file, that's going to be the default file loaded to my for this page. So I'm going to delete my test. I don't need it anymore. And now I'm going to also create a blank skeleton of my page. Whoops. And there we go. So let's name it home. Just Jot It, because that's the name of a wrap. Also, let's begin with just a nice header saying just Jot It, and begin with a basic folder structure like, I don't know, let's call this a section. And this is going to be the welcome page, I guess, could be. So just hello. Let's reload this. Oh, I forgot to also start with NodeMon. So if you remember, NodeMon is a very nice plugin which we can run to allow us to automatically restart our Node.js server when we make changes. On the second thought, that won't help us too much because I'm making changes on the front end, and NodeMon does not listen for changes on the public folder, sadly. So I guess we will just have to keep doing that npm start thing. Let's refresh this super quickly. And there we go. Here's our index page we just created. I can just wipe this out and it should still work because index gets loaded regardless if you don't specify. That's what we call it, index page. Now, this is looking very rough around the edges, so I'm just going to plug in a quick CSS file I wrote. We're not going to delve too much in detail because the focus of this workshop is more on the JavaScript side of the logic of it. But it's very basic. It's not very complex, to be honest. So let's just write just jotit.css. It's quite small for just the entire project. As you can see, there's just very basic styling, like adding a different font, just some basic rules, basic styling to keep it from looking so plain. I'm also using a custom font from Google Fonts. So for those unfamiliar, Google Fonts is an awesome free font repository you can use. And that's where I download all my fonts because they're just amazing fonts here and they're free to use. So I just Google Repoto Mono. There we go. That's my font of choice. Click on plus. Now, there you go. That's selected. And all I have to do is just copy this to my page and I should be set. So let's do that right now. Let's paste it in above our style sheet like so. So first style sheet. Okay, the first one is going to be that one with Roboto Mono, and then our CSS style sheet, which is going to be just jotit.css. Now that should be up and running. Let's try refreshing our page, and there we go. Looks quite a bit cleaner. So that's our landing page for just Jotit. Now, before we begin, we also need to make a bit of a structure, like how are we going to lay out our page. So the way I structured my application is that I have a navigation in my main dashboard, and my navigation has two main areas. So it has a default menu, which is given for users who aren't logged in, and an authentication menu, which is given for users who are logged in. So I'm just going to plop that in here. So let me just delete that. And this is what my nav looks like. So my nav, as I mentioned, I have two sections. I have nav default menu and nav auth menu. Now, the thing about this is that notice how I have both of them hidden. And what do I mean by them hidden? Because I added this attribute called hidden. If I reload the page, as I'm doing right now, notice how neither is shown. And even though they both exist, like notice my nav, there are both menus, but you can't see either of them. This is thanks to that hidden attribute. The reason why I use hidden is because I want to first verify if the user is authenticated or not authenticated. And depending on that action, I'm going to show a different submenu. Now, authentication is kind of the maybe a hard point here. So that's something we're going to be dealing with very shortly. But before we do that, there's something you need to consider. When the user reloads the page, how do you plan to store data? How do you plan to verify if the user was logged in previously? And this is something that we call data persistence, because even if the user logs in and they get the JSON Web Token, you need to store that somewhere so that when you refresh the page, it doesn't get lost. And that is where there's something called session and local storage exists. So Session storage is this nice and handy thing that stores basically it's almost like cookies. Cookies are similar in function in that cookies can be used to save data for a website, and they're saved in your browser even after you refresh it or close it or whatever. But cookies were mainly made for another purpose, which isn't data storage. In this sense, it's better to use local or session storage. The difference between the both of them is session is basically cleared when you close your browser. So if I close this tab and open it again, session storage will still be there. But if I close the browser and open it again, session storage gets wiped. So in that situation, local storage is a bit more useful. It's a bit more of long-term storage. Now to use it, you can simply just Google local storage, JavaScript, and usually Mozilla Developer Network has a very good, strong explanation of how to use it to store data into your local storage. And it's quite simple to use. It's literally just doing local storage, set item, and get item. So that's going to be our first step, believe it or not. We want that when the app starts, we want to first make sure that we're checking our local storage to see if the user was logged in. And same thing goes. We want to also, when the user logs in, we want to also save everything to local storage so it can be accessed on the next page refresh. And for that reason, we're going to start building what we call our utilities module. So I'm going to create a new folder called utilities. And the reason why I do that is because I did mention this workshop was going to be built using some of the best practice for modularization we use in this industry. And one of them is modularizing everything. So in this situation, because what we're doing is literally just caching, we're basically storing something in the browser so we can be loaded later. We're going to be writing a module for that. So we're going to create a new file, creating a cache.module.js file. And this file, I'm going to write a few functions which will be used to basically get the user from the local storage. So my first function is going to be something like this. So it's going to be function get authenticated user from cache. So all it's going to do is going to be fetching a user from local storage. So as you can see, I'm using local storage.getItem to fetch the JWT token, user ID, username, name, and email. And once I fetched all of this, I then do a quick check and verify if JSON Web Token exists. That's the best indicator for me to know that the user does exist. And only if that is true, then I return the object. If JSON Web Token doesn't exist, then I just return undefined, because then there is no user stored on cache. Now, just like I wrote a function here for that, I'm also going to write two more functions, which will be very handy soon enough, which are called save authenticated user into cache. And all this does is it receives a user object and it saves every property of the user into a different local storage key, as you can see right here. So I'm storing the user's JSON Web Token, ID, username, name, and email. And then I am basically storing everything into a different key. And then I'm also going to create a different function. So while this one will be used when you try to log in to save the user's information into cache, I'm going to create one that will be used on logout, because when you log out, you need to delete everything from local storage as well. And because I do not want to do it manually all over the place, I'm going to also write a function for that called delete authenticated user from cache. So what I achieved right now is I consolidated every basically feature from caching into one file, keeping my code tidy and modular. Now that this is set up, I should be almost set up as far as my basic logic. So let's go to our index page. So I'm going to write a JavaScript file for this called indexpage.js. And this one, I'm going to basically first write my famous $document.ready on page load. And all this is doing is I'm getting a function to execute when the page loads. So this is thanks to jQuery, which, by the way, I haven't loaded yet. So that's something I need to fix, by the way, super quick. So let's quickly go to jQuery, CDN, and let's add that to our index.html. So let's just quickly set that here. So let's download the latest version of jQuery. Let's copy the script and let us add that to our scripts. So at the end of it, let's add our script source of, oh, you know what? That one's going to be our index page, yes. And before that, we need to make sure, don't forget, you should always load jQuery before you load your actual JavaScript code, because your code relies on jQuery. Now, that's set up. This should work. And proof of that is just doing maybe a quick alert. So alert 1, 2, 3. Let's save that. Excuse me. And refresh that. And we can see that it definitely loaded. We get a nice alert saying that our function is being called. Now, inside of this, I'm going to write a new function called update authenticated UI, which I'm going to define right here. So let's do that right now. So here's our function, update authenticated UI. Now, what I'm about to do is I'm going to first assign my authenticated user into a variable. And then I'm going to fetch it using my get authenticated user from cache function, which I defined in my cache module. Now, I'm going to then use that to check if the auth user does exist. I'm going to then use a global called auth user, which I haven't defined, by the way. I'm going to assign it to auth user. And then this is where the magic happens. Remember how I showed you how we had two submenus, the default and authenticated menu? Depending if the user exists, I'm going to show only one of them. So for example, because this is what happens when the when the user is logged in, then this is what gets run. So it's nav greeting, HTML, and auth menu. So basically, it's going to add a greeting with the authenticated user's name, and also it's going to show the authenticated menu. However, if the user is not logged in, then we basically show the default menu, like so. Now, there's two big problems with this. Number one, there's no way we can use this, even though it's a global. It's a terrible practice to use this as a global variable from another function. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a module. So I'm going to create a module object. This is what we call namespacing. And it's a great modularizing practice. So I'm going to create a module called cache module. And then I'm going to, inside of cache module, assign all my functions. Like get authenticated user from cache, save authenticated user into cache, and delete authenticated user into cache. And now what that allows me to do is access all the functions just by this one module. So that allows me to have less globals around. And now to use this from any other file, all I have to do is just assign it to a very cool variable called window. Now, window is basically the global variable in your browser. So whatever you attach to window can be used on any, basically by any file. So if file number 1 saves window.a equals 1, then any other file that loads after this one can access that variable using window.a. So it's very handy to expose functionality. So in this case, I'm going to assign to window.cache module my cache module, as you can see right here. And that allows me to then, on my index page, I can just as easily just import this like so at the top of the file. So just when this file gets loaded, I create a new cache variable where I load my window cache module. So that's what allows me to use it. And also, I have to update that here because this is now using my cache. So now it's cache.get authenticated user from cache. That's more explicit. There's also one extra final step which we haven't done, and that's load our cache module. So let's fix that right now. Let's do script, and let's do script source, and that's going to be utilities / cache module.js. And there we go. That should be working now. There's one extra thing we also want to do. Using globals is usually a terrible practice. You do not want to be creating too many globals. The reason is simple. Once you join a real project, you're going to be working with dozens, if not hundreds of people. Like there is projects that large. The one I work with has thousands of people working on the same project. So odds are you and one of the other 1,000 people might have created a global variable that sounds the same. And for that exact reason, you should strive to not create too many globals, because you could be affecting the work of somebody else. And for that reason, I'm just going to create one global and save everything into that. And because this global represents my application state, I'm going to name it state, because it's the state of my current application. And then I'm going to assign my auth user global to state. And every time I want to access my authenticated user, I'm going to just do state.auth user. That's going to do the trick. And that's pretty much finished. If I refresh the page, we should now have a nice piece of, oh, we forgot to call our function. Let's call, when the page loads, call update authenticated UI. And when we save that and refresh it, we now see a nice greeting saying, welcome to Just Jotted, your own notebook on the cloud. To create and view your notes, please log in. So that all works thanks to our JavaScript code, which when the page loads, it checks using our nice modular code using cache.getAuthenticated from cache. But because there's nothing, as you can see in local storage right now, there's absolutely nothing. And that's why it doesn't find it. And as such, it basically unhides the default menu. The default menu is the one you're seeing right now. So this is the default menu. But if the user was actually logged in, then they would have assigned the auth menu. So that's pretty much a good enough explanation as far as modules go. Let's create the remaining functionality. So another piece of functionality we really need is an HTTP module, because when we try to log in and sign up, you need to make an Ajax request, all right? So for that Ajax request part, you want to create an HTTP module as well to house all your HTTP calls. So that's going to do right now. So HTTP module.js. Let's, here's our HTTP module. And here I'm going to create, basically this is just a simple function, which is going to be used to both sign up and log in the user. So in this situation, as you can see in the sign up user, all it's requesting is a simple options object, which gets passed in options like user data, on success, and on error, which we extract thanks to ES6 structuring. Very handy. And then we use these parameters to make an Ajax request to the server endpoint. And I specify all the important information, like how to sign up a user, how to pass in data, the error handling, and the success method, which is in this scenario, I'm basically adding, basically everything is passed in. So this is what we call functional programming. This function does not alter in any way the data that gets input, and it's very easy to use. It's very maintainable, and it can be used from any file. So overall, it's a fantastic thing to use. So I'm just going to write a login function that looks a bit like this, which is very similar. Basically, all my functions are going to follow very similar patterns. And the reason why I'm putting them all in one file or one module is because it makes them easier to maintain for me. It makes it easy for me to think, oh, and basically an HTTP error occurred. Well, it has to be with the way I'm doing my HTTP calls. So it's easy for me to just go to the right file by just doing this thing. So it's very handy for me. Now, what else we can do is we cannot use this yet. We need to create a module as well here. So in this situation, I'm going to create our const HTTP module as so, and then I'm going to store sign up user and login user. There you go. So here's the sign up user and login user. So now that we have our HTTP functions to sign up and log in the user, let's start creating our pages for that. So for that, I'm going to create a new folder to host that piece of functionality called auth. So instead of auth, I'm going to create my two files, which are going to be login and sign up. So login.html and signup.html. So now, for this section, just because we're kind of short on time, I'm just going to copy over the code I already have pre-written, which is a lot of boilerplate, but basically covering it super quickly. It includes as usual, my Google Fonts, includes my CSS. It includes a very basic header, a form to sign up, some inputs, like, for example, if I'm signing up. Oh, and by the way, this is not the login. This should be the sign up form. So let's just move that to the correct container. So here's my login form. As you can see, for login, I do require things like the name, the email, the username, the password, and then just a simple submit button. Also, I do have a bit of some nice handy navigation. So for example, here I have a nav container with a link that takes me to index.html named back to home. And then another one that says already have an account, then click here. And that just redirects you to the login page, which is also inside of Auth login. Now, one thing I want to mention is I'm starting my URLs with a slash. All that means is that the slash means that it searches for this file at the root of your server. And because the root of my server is public, that's why I can do /index, and it will always take me to public/index. Or in this situation, /auth/login takes me to public/auth/login. That's why I like to do it. It keeps my URLs easy for me to remember and understand. Now that that's set up, I also want to show you that I did include jQuery, as in all situations. I have 4 script tags, which you might be surprised, but we'll get them to them soon enough. So we have our HTTP module, which we already created. We created our cache module, but we also have basically a call to render module, which we haven't created yet. So we're just going to create it right now because we will use it very soon. But just know that that's going to be used very soon. So there's my render module. Now, at the end, it does launch or add page.js, which we're going to also create right about now. So auth.page.js. And also keep in mind that this one starts with a dot. So the dot means start searching for this file in this current folder I'm in. So because this sign up page exists in Auth, it starts looking in Auth for Auth page. It is something to keep things a bit cleaner and a bit tidier. So that's set up. Let's do the code for login, which is going to be very, very similar. Basically, I think it's pretty much identical. Just removing some of the information that's not required. In this situation, we only need the username and password, not the name, not the email. And also, the buttons are inverted. So instead of having a URL to login, this one takes you to sign up. So you can navigate between the both of them. And also, it loads the same files, like all the modules, which we need, as well as the auth page. Now, notice how I'm using auth page for both of them. This is something I did because it's actually not, I could have split this up, but these two modules are so small, I decided to group them in one file. So this auth page is going to be used for both login and sign up. So this should leave us with a non-functional login and sign up. So let's test that theory out super quickly. If we refresh this, if I click on the login button, notice how the login page works. And if I click on the don't have an account, that works as well. However, neither of these are functional. So if I create on this button, it's going to do absolutely nothing. Same thing goes for the login. I haven't done anything to handle the login, as you can see here. And if I click home, all it does, it takes me back to index. So this is already looking semi-functional. So now let's work on the logic, which is probably what a lot of you are interested in, how you can actually call the authentication. Now, this part, thankfully, is greatly simplified thanks to the modularization we already did previously. So if we go to our auth page, as previously, I'm just going to import all my modules. So I'm going to do something like this. Copy this over from I'm going to close my login page. I don't need that. Oh yeah, I think I can keep my modules open at the left because I will be using them very soon. So there you go. So at the beginning of my authentication module, I import my state, I import my cache module, and I'm also going to import my HTTP module. So window.cache HTTP module, excuse me. There we go. Now, we also probably want to call the document onReady as usual fashion. So let's do that. So let's do function on page load, and then do a jQuery document.ready. Now, the reason why I like to do this is because if you don't do this and you just execute JavaScript code right away, it might be running before the page finishes loading. So by writing your code inside of an entry point function and handing it to jQuery's document.ready event, you make sure your JavaScript code is executed until after everything on the page loads. So it's very handy. Now, I have to write 2 event handlers in this situation to handle the submission of the sign up and the login form. So I'm going to do that right now. So very simple. When you submit the sign up form, do the on sign up submit. And when you submit the login form, on login submit. Now let's do the on sign up submit because I think that's that's the first one we should tackle. So our first function is going to be on sign up submit. So it's going to be looking a bit like this. So our sign up submit receives an event as usual fashion. So you can see that I received the event. I like to do event.prevent default because that prevents any browser behavior because I know what I'm doing. I know how I'm going to handle this event. So I do not want the browser to do anything other than let me handle this. So I do that right here. Notice that this function is the one I pass directly to onSubmit. Now, the next thing I do is I create a user data object as shown here. So I'm doing user data equals, and then to each property, I just assign the value of the input in my HTML. Now, keep in mind, I am doing no validation whatsoever, which was a kind of a big mistake, but we barely have enough time to cover everything in the hour. So keep in mind that you might want to do some basic validation here. I just used the basic form validation, which is basically that if you add the required field, you already made sure that the user did input everything as required. But just do know that this has very little validation on the front end. Now, with that working, we now have to make the Ajax call. But hang on a sec. Remember how we already wrote our Ajax calls inside of a module? So yeah, we basically already did that, and we're actually going to use them. And basically, the way we do that is quite simple. We already have our HTTP module, as you can see right here. So if I go to my HTTP module, I already have a function that basically creates an Ajax call. So I'm going to use HTTP module.signup_user, and then that allows me to just pass in the information that matters. So that's the user data as the first parameter. Then the second parameter is on success, and the third parameter is on error. So that simplifies greatly the way of using Ajax. I just have to call this one method, and that makes it super easy for me to just use it. Don't worry about the implementation details, and that will just work. So as you can see, I'm passing in the user data as a first argument, which if I, for example, let's have these open side by side, so maybe this makes a bit more sense. So our first parameter is the user data. Second one is on success, and third one is on error. Notice how these are all named parameters, so that's why I can pass them in any order, and this will still work. This is why I like to use, instead of passing multiple parameters, I like to use an object. It makes it easier to maintain. So if I want to move these around, nothing will happen because order doesn't matter on objects. Now, when I do sign up the user, then I do have an on success saying username was created. You may now log in. And then notice how it redirects you. So I'm doing window.open to /login, and _self just makes it so it doesn't open a new tab. And if an error happens, then I just set an alert saying there was a problem processing your request. Please try again later. And that should be working. So why don't we try it out? Let's first, before we try it out, open my Robo3T instance so you can be sure I have nothing on my database. So here's my Robo3T instance, so you can see that I have no users in my just jotted database. So you can see I have no users, and I might have nodes. Oh, don't have nodes. Nice. So I have no information. Now that should be set up. So let's make sure we can call this. We can sign up for a user. So let's click on don't have an account. Let's refresh this, and we have an error saying Logout Submit is not defined. Okay, I think we need to define that. So let's just generate it really quick, and we'll explain it soon enough. So let's add our onLogin submit function here. So here's onLogin submit, and you can see that now, if I refresh the page, there should be no errors. If I try to create a new account with Sergey Garcia, sgarcia@email.com, my username is going to be sgarcia, and password 1. If I click on create account, It says cannot read properties sign up user of undefined. Let's figure out why. So HTTP sign up user. It sounds like I didn't import my module as expected. Let's verify that claim. Let's open our HTTP module, and I can find the error. We forgot to do window.htp module. So let's fix that right now. Window.htp module is equals HTTP module. Super critical you do this to make sure you expose it correctly. Let's try this one more time. Sergi Garcia, email is garcia@email.com, and the user is going to be Garcia, and password 1. There we go. Create account, and user Garcia created. You may now log in, and it redirects me to the login. To prove that, let's just open our Robot3T database, click on users, and there's our user. So it's created successfully. Now, the login is where things will definitely get interesting. So the login is very similar in that it's very like the same thing, just gathering the user data into an object, calling this time the HTTP login user method, which all it differs is literally the URL. So URL changes from API/user post to API auth login post. So it's going to be just using that abstraction method. What changes is the on success. That's where things become a bit different. So because when I have a success on the response, I get a response that has the user and the JSON Web Token in it, in the way I built my server. So all I'm doing is I extract the authenticated the user from the response and save it into a variable called authenticated user, and then I attach to it the JWT token, which is also in the response. So I have all the information, both the user and the token, inside of just one object called authenticated user. Then, if you remember, we had our cache module. So here's our cache module. Remember the save authenticated user into cache function? That saves the authenticated user into our cache, and basically allows us to save it into local storage. And this takes charge and save everything into local storage if everything works. And if that works, then it says login successful, redirecting you to homepage, and it redirects you to the root of the website, which is the homepage. Let's try that theory out and see what happens. So let's refresh the page. And before we do this, we're going to debug this super quickly to show you what happens when this is successful. So I'm going to log in with my recently created user and password. And when I try to log in, notice how the response contains the JSON Web Token and the user object. So I first create authenticated user, as you can see here. So in my scope, you can see that my authenticated user contains the actual user. And then I attach to the JSON Web Token the JWT token in the response, allowing us to have a more complete object. Like you can see here, there's the JWT token. I then pass that into cache to save authenticated user into cache. Before I do that, notice how if I check my local storage, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing here. But as soon as I run that line of code and I go back to authentication, now everything is saved into local storage. And now if I click on my play button, let my code run with the alert, it says login successful, redirecting you to homepage, and it redirects me to my homepage. Now, this time, notice how we're greeted with a very nice welcome, Sergi Garcia. I get a nice logout button and I create new node. This is thanks to my index page. Remember how if when you load the index, it checks the authenticated user from cache, from your local storage. If it does exist, then it sets the state's auth user property to auth user, and it unhides basically the authenticated menu, which you can also take a peek right here. So here's my index.js page. And notice how my authenticated menu includes the welcome user nav greeting. I have a logout button, which is just a button, and then a ref link that redirects me to the /node/create HTML, which is not implemented yet. So let's do that. So let's implement that. But for that to work, we need to also create our nodes folder. So let's do that right now. So let's go to new folder, node. And then inside of node, we're going to start creating our components. So it's going to be something like node, let's do create.html. Same as before, we have our standard boilerplate that looks a bit like this. So our standard boilerplate includes the Roboto font or CSS, or we have a tiny menu here that takes us back to home. So href back to home. We'll have a menu that looks a bit like this, saying create new node, then a simple form with the fields like title, content, and then the submit to create that. And as usual, load all their code. So it's jQuery, all the utility files, and or create page JavaScript, which we don't have yet. So let's create that, create.page.js. And let's try to load this to see how it looks like. So if I refresh the page and click on create new node, I'm redirected to my create new node page, which looks a bit like this. It's very simple and it does nothing. I have no code for this to handle. So this should do nothing, but the button should definitely work. So I can go back to home, no problem. So let's set the code to add a new node. So the code to add a new node is actually quite simple. So if I go to my create page JavaScript, which is this one I have right here. So my code, as usual, I need some standard boilerplate. So I'm going to paste it right here. So it's my state. I need my modules. This time, notice how I'm also using the render module, which might be coming handy very soon. I haven't exposed it yet. So that's something I need to fix as well, which I should do right now. Let me do that super quickly. So here's my render module. Let's just do const render module equals empty object. And let's do window.render module equals render module. Now that that's set up, I can start writing my create page .js. So my create page, as usual, has its standard document ready and unready functions. So I'm going to add those in. And this time, there's something new. Notice how, as usual, I'm using the cache.getAuthenticated from cache to fetch my authenticated user from the local storage. And then I'm also just having one event handler, which is the onCreateFormSubmit. So that's something I'm going to also add, which is just a simple function that's going to be run whenever you submit the form. So it's very simple. Notice how that's all we need for this page to work. We just need to handle the event that gets fired when you submit the form. So that's set up. And once that's working, we should be able to submit. Now, notice how here what's happening is that when you try to create a new node, it, as usual, does event.preventDefault. It creates a new node using the jQuery data, and then using our HTTP module, we call the create node method, which, if you notice, we do not have yet. So that's something we need to fix as well. So let us add to our HTTP module, or what would be the function name? It has to be our create node function. So let's create that right now. So let me find that super quick. Okay, so here's my function, which I'm looking for. Let's add it here. So our function is, as usual, standard fashion. We extract from the options the JSON web token, the new node, the onSuccess, and our onError. Then we make the Ajax request to it to API/node. We add the data parsed in JSON.stringified format. And here's where it gets interesting, because creation of nodes requires authentication. You need to set the authorization headers like so. So I'm setting it here, XHR set request header, authorization bearer token, and then I pass in the JSON web token, which is also a required parameter for this function. I then, if successful, I call the onSuccess callback, which gets passed in, and if it's an error, I call the onError callback. Now that that's set up, that should be just about working. And by the way, I noticed I created this function on the wrong file. So let's just move this over to the correct file, which would be the HTTP module. So let's write, or you know what? Let's just paste in all the required functionalities for HTTP, because notice how they're all very similar. So this doesn't really vary very much. The only thing I really wanted to show you guys was how I set the authorization bearer token. So it's going to paste everything down here. So this is what it will look like once you wrote calls to all your endpoints. So I have my get user nodes endpoint, my get node by ID endpoint, my create node endpoint, my update node endpoint, and my delete node endpoint. So I can just call any of these methods and it will make the corresponding Ajax request to that. So, and remember, if you have questions, as usual, you can just check out the GitHub code full. So that's set up. This should work. Now, the thing is, this might not work as expected, because notice how when the node gets created successfully, it tries to redirect you to /node/details, which is basically just a view that shows you the node details. So that's something we're just going to change for the time being. We're just going to comment this out, and we're going to redirect you to the home page for the time being, because we do not have this functionality yet. So let's redirect ourselves to this, our home page, and that should work. We should be able to create nodes. So let's try that. Let's click on create new nodes. Let's set a test title and a test content. And notice how it says node created successfully, redirecting. And it looks like I have no nodes. That is correct, because we didn't make sure we loaded all our nodes from the database yet. But I'm going to use robot2t to verify if it really did create my nodes. So notice how in my nodes collection, I have one object, the node, which I just created today. So it's definitely working as expected. It's just I have no logic in my index page to load my nodes when this loads. And for that, I'm going to have to expand on my index.js page. So on my index page, I'm going to have to add a bit of functionality. Like, for example, when the page loads, I want to basically get the user nodes if the user is authenticated. And for that, I can do it with this very handy code snippet. So if the state has the auth user variable, which, by the way, remember, I populate using update authenticated UI, then I do http.getUserNodes. Remember, that's a function in our HTTP module. So if you go to HTTP module and click on get user nodes, it's calling this function. So it fetches my user nodes. And notice how for this to work, you do have to pass in the JSON Web Token and the onSuccess. Otherwise, this won't work. So I pass in my JSON Web Token from the state. So in state.authUser.JSON Web Token, that's where it is. And then on success, we have a missing piece, because when it's successful, we need to render the nodes list, but we don't have that functionality, but we will soon. So that's part of a render module. So we're going to begin our render module by adding our render nodes list method, like so. So our render nodes list is going to be a simple function, looks a bit like this. So it's going to be just a function that receives the nodes from the database. Then it does nodes.map, and it converts each node using a very handy function called node to HTML. And then it joins all of them with a handy divider. Then once we divide all, basically join converts the array into a single string. And then that nodes HTML gets injected into our nodes list container, which we do not have. So we need to fix that right now. Let's fix that ASAP. So let's go to our index.js page. And after the nav bar, let's just add our node list section, because that's where it's going to inject our nodes list. And with that, we should actually be able to have pretty much a functional dashboard. So let's try refreshing the page and see if we have anything missing. And it looks like we do. It says HTTP is not defined. So it seems like we forgot, because we've been doing updates back and forth. We didn't include the HTTP method. HTTP module, excuse me. And for that reason, I'm just going to include it straight away. I'm going to include all of them, just in case I need any of them. So I'm going to include all my modules, like so, in case I need them. And then I'm going to make sure that I do not have, give me a second. So let's just load our example, like shown here. And we still have a problem saying cannot read property get user nodes of undefined. Let's see what the problem is. So HTTP get user nodes. Let's verify where's the problem. It's probably with our HTTP module. We didn't expose it correctly. So here's our HTTP module get user nodes. There's a problem here. What could be going wrong? Let's verify if we can do HTTP is undefined. HTTP module is undefined as well. I think it might be if we didn't load. Yeah, of course. It never loaded our HTTP module. So it's a very simple rookie mistake. I forgot to load all my files as necessary. So let's also go to our index page and let's add in all the modules we've been using up until this point. So let's just add them all in for safety. So there's all our 4 modules, our cache module, render module, and our HTTP module. Notice how I try to load them in the order that they are least dependent on each other. Cache does not depend on anything. Render might depend on cache, and HTTP definitely can't depend on any of the other previous ones. So I do have to keep being cautious about the order. That should, in all hopes, be working. So let's try refreshing the page. And it looks like it is not throwing an error. So let's figure out why. If we look at the network panel and refresh the page, we can see that the request did get received, but it looks like it didn't render it. So let's figure out why. I'm guessing it was a problem with the way we set up our handler. So if we look at the rendered nodes list, I have a hunch we haven't populated that. So here's render nodes list. Of course, we forgot to add it to a render module. So let's do render nodes list. Hopefully that will get rid of the error. So let's refresh our page one more time. And there we go. So notice how all it did was each node it received from the database, it gets passed in to our render nodes list function on a render module. It then converts it using this handy function called node to HTML. I do some interesting logic here to basically, if the node length, that basically the node content is larger than 120 characters, I trim it to only 120 characters, because I imagine the user wrote a node that is 1,000, 5,000 characters long. So only if it's larger than that size, I trim it to 120 characters to make it a node summary. I then create basically, this is that template that gets used for every node. And that's what gets converted to my nodes HTML, which is what you're seeing right here. Now, we're getting very close to basically what is a pretty much functional app. If I create a new node and I do another node number 2 and another content and I create this, we already have the ability to create nodes and to view nodes, as you can see here, but we still aren't able to delete nodes or edit nodes. So for that, we're going to really quickly add in the functionality to, for example, click on them. So we can click on them and view the node details as well as editing. So these last 2 features should be a lot quicker to get by because all the core logic is already here. All we need to do is just add a few more functions to our render module, which I'm just going to do right now because it's just less time consuming that way. So here are all the functions we're going to be using. So it's going to be the render nodes list, which is going to be rendering the nodes, which we already used. The render node details, which is what we're going to use in a second, because once you click on a node, you want to render the node's details. And then finally, the render editable node, which is what's going to happen when you click on the edit button. So let's first create the details view. So let's go to our node and let's create a new file called node details. So let's create that right now, details.html. And as usual, let's just paste in our boilerplate as usual. So copy, paste, and notice how, as usual, we have our Google fonts, CSS, back to home navigation menu, a header for editing node, and a node edit form. So I just kept this as is, even if I'm not editing it. So you know what? I think I just picked out the wrong template. So let me just fix that super quick. Yep, definitely was using the wrong template. So there you go. That's the details form, as you can see here. So the only difference is that I have my back to home, but notice how node details is blank. And the reason why is because I first need to retrieve the node's details from the database. And the way I do that is kind of interesting. So if you go back to the index page, so let me go back to the index. You know what? No, the create page. So remember how when you created a node, it wanted to redirect you to the details form. So we're going to restore that behavior back in. And notice how the way it works is it does node/details HTML, and then it passes as a parameter the node ID. And that's something we're going to use very soon. So if we create our details JS, so if we go to node, new file, details.page.js, it's going to be having, as usual, the typical boilerplate code. So it's going to be all our modules. Now, we do have a new module called etc. because this is for functionality which just doesn't fit in any other module. And you're going to see what we're going to be using etc. for. So as usual, we have our function on ready, and I'm just going to copy the code back in. So this is what's going to happen when you click on node details. So when you load the page, first it's going to fetch the ID from the string parameter. So notice how we pass in the ID like so inside the request parameter. We have to extract that somehow. Now, this is relatively hard functionality. So I just Googled on how to extract this from the internet, and this is literally somebody else's response. So I just created a module with that piece of functionality. So if I go to my etc. module, which I'm creating right now, I'm just going to use that piece of functionality, which is something that I can use to basically fetch the ID from the query string. Don't worry about how this works. Just know that this is something we can find on the internet to fetch the parameter. And now that I have that, I am able to fetch the node ID from the URL as I'm sending it right here. Then I, using my cache module, get the auth user from the cache, including his JSON Web Token. And then I can use my HTTP methods get node by ID by fetching the node ID I received, as you can see here from state.nodeID. And then on success, I render my node details, which is the function I have in my render module. So as you can see, my render module receives the node details. So if I click on the function, it receives a node object, and then all it does is it injects into node details element. It injects the following HTML, which is literally just the node's contents. So if I run this, right now, the only way I'm going to be able to get this trigger is by creating a new node. So let's create a new node. Let's create node number 3 and test content. Let's create a new node. Node created successfully, redirecting. And now notice how it took us to our details.html page with the ID of the node. And then when the page load, all it did was basically fetch. Now, if I take a look at the network panel, notice how it made a URL request to our endpoint, API/node/ or ID of the node. And then it responded with basically the node's contents. And then our function, which was the render node details function, gets called on success. And that's what gets in charge of rendering this actual node content into HTML. And we can find all of this inside of the utilities folder, as you can see here. So if I maybe refresh the page and place a breakpoint on render node details, notice how it gets called with the node information from the server. And that's what's allowing us to actually render the content. So once you modularize everything, I think you'll notice like how everything just is so easy to plug in and play. Like nothing is complex anymore. Everything just makes sense because you're just using tiny bits of modules like Lego pieces. Like it's you creating your own custom Lego pieces, and building an app is less about building an app and just joining together the blocks that you built. So that's pretty much it. Now we also need to add functionality to our index page so that when you click on a node, it actually takes you to the details of the node. So that's something we're going to do really quick as well. So our index page is going to be adding an extra piece of functionality called when you click on a node card from the list. So I'm going to do if node list. Every time I click on it on a node card element, then it's going to be calling this function called on node card click, and all that one is going to do is quite simple, and it's literally just a handler to redirect us. So basically, because the way I create my nodes, this is kind of interesting. If you look at my render module, the way I render my nodes, notice how each node has its node ID instead of a data attribute. And the reason why I store this in the HTML is so that when you click on one, I can do event.currentTarget and then grab the attribute data node ID. So I fetch the node's ID and then I use that to redirect them to node/details and then pass in the ID as part of it. And this is what allows me to smartly redirect to the node details and pass it the node ID that was just clicked. So it's a very handy, direct way of forwarding information. And also while I'm at it, I might as well add logout functionality because I already have everything I kind of need for the logout functionality. So let's add that in. So every time I click on the logout button, which I already have, it's going to execute the onLogout button click, and all that function is going to do is something like this. So when it gets received, I do a confirmation prompt saying, are you sure you want to log out? And if the user confirmed, then I use my cache modules, delete authenticated user from cache, which if you remember, all it does was delete the user's information from local storage, and then it just redirects them to auth login. So very handy. Now let's try to see if this works. Let's go back to home, and let's try to click on a node and see what happens. And it's working. We can now click and navigate between nodes in a simple, easy fashion. Now, I know we've gone over time for 3 minutes, so excuse some of the people who might have to leave. Do remember that this is being recorded, so in case you want to maybe watch the rest of it during a time of due leisure, but let's just continue because we're so close to finishing it. It's just that, I think you already noticed, there's just so much content for an hour, so let's wrap this up. So we have our ability to navigate between nodes very easily, and we also can log out. So if we click on logout, it asks us, do you want to log out? I'm going to click cancel. It doesn't log me out, but if I do click OK, it takes me out of the page, redirects me to login, and it wipes out my credentials from local storage. So I have to log in again manually, like so, and then click on login. As usual, let's just move the debugger breakpoints, let it play. Login successful, redirecting you to home page, and that works as expected. And our application storage now has all our information again. So that's pretty much set up. Now let's add the deletion functionality, because I think that's super easy to get before we actually get to the editing. So let's fix that right now. Let's go to our index.js file, and let's add that functionality. So in our index JavaScript file, we're going to add an event handler so that when you click on the delete node button, it's going to do something. So when you click on a delete node button element, it's going to call the onDelete button click function. So I'm going to define that function as well right here. So let's do that. And this one's going to be a bit of a somewhat crazy function, but bear with me because it's actually quite simple once we explain it. So when you click on the delete button for a card, something interesting happens. Because the delete button, if you look at my page, delete exists inside of a node item. So if you click delete, it also counts like you clicked on the node. So it will try to redirect you to the node details. And this is a problem that a lot of JavaScript applications can have when you try to click on something that's inside of something else that's also listening for events. And for that reason, I'm going to do something interesting called event.stop immediate propagation. All that does is it makes sure that the other event listener, the one that listens for on node card clicks, doesn't fire. So stop propagation stops that from firing. Now that that's set up, we extract the node ID using the usual. We use jQuery to extract the click event that was just clicked on. Then it uses closest to find the parent with the node card element. And as previous, we extract from the parent the data node ID, similar to how we did it when you clicked on the node card ID when we did .attribute. So it's the same logic, only that because this time we weren't clicking on the actual card element, we were clicking on the button, we had to do that closest extra syntax. Once that's done, we ask the user to confirm if they're sure they want to delete this node. If they start yes, then we actually do the HTTP delete node method, which we already have in our HTTP module, as you can see here. So HTTP delete node, there's our delete node. And we pass in, or as usual, our node ID. We pass in our JSON web token as part of our state.auth.json web token. Remember that the reason we can do all of this is because we're always doing, when the page loads, we extract from cache the auth user. So that's the reason we can do all of this at all. So it tries to delete that. And if it is successful, it says node deleted successfully, reloading the results. And then all it does is it literally does HTTP get user nodes all over again, and if it's successful, it re-renders the node list again. So it's very simple, very straightforward. So let's try the logic. Let's try to refresh the page. Click on delete. Are you sure you want to delete this node? Okay. No, deleted, reloaded results. And there you go. It's definitely working as expected. So we're very close to finishing it and wrapping up. We only need to add the editing functionality, which might sound like quite a bit of a challenge, but actually it's not, thanks to all the logic we built in. So the edit functionality is reached by clicking on the edit node button. So if we go to our details page, JS basically, this is actually that we don't really have to do any work, thankfully, because we actually already did the work in the render module. So if you look at the render node details, notice how the edit node button already has basically the information necessary. All we have to do is listen to that button to actually basically go to the edit form. So let's go to our details page to add that functionality to edit it. So here's our details page JS, and we're going to add that function which was missing, that when you click on the edit node button, call the onEdit node button click. And all that's going to do is literally do function on edit node button, event.prevent default, and it opens a new node to the node/edit HTML with the node ID. The reason why we can do node ID is because we grabbed it previously. Remember how we saved this to state? This is why we use our state variable to save anything we need into it. And once that's set up, we have our navigation set. We just need to add our final view, which is the edit HTML view. So here's our edit HTML view. As usual, let's add the ton of boilerplate we need. So in this boilerplate, we just need, as usual, the CSS, the title, a quick navigation back to home, a header for edit form, an ID for the edit of the form, then just some basic title and content field sets, and then the input, which is just saving the changes. As usual, I load all my JavaScript, which is my etc. module, cache module, render module, HTTP module, all of it. And then, of course, my edit page module, which is my final JavaScript file, which we'll be creating today. So our edit page, as usual, let's create the boilerplate. So our boilerplate looks a bit like this. So we have our state, all our modules, and when the page loads, we do a few things. As usual, because when you clicked on the edit button, it redirects you to a URL that looks a bit like this, node/edit.html, and then the parameter of ID. We need to extract it using our etc. get query string program module. We extract the ID from it, save it into the state, then we extract a user from the local storage if he's authenticated, and then it immediately does get node by ID. So this will retrieve the node details information so we can render the edit form. So it retrieves it using the node ID. So notice how if we go to our get node by ID function, so here's our get node by ID. When that gets called, it receives the node ID and on success, it gets the node information. This time, because we do not need authentication, I just a fetch request, we can do get JSON. And if it's successful, it calls render.render editable node. And this one, thankfully, is a lot easier on the eyes. So this time, instead of rendering an entire form content, we can just modify it. So we just do title text. So this is from our edit form. So it modifies the title text input. It undisables it because right now I load them as disabled. So the user cannot input or modify them while they're loading. It removes the disabled property and then it inputs the value that it retrieved from the server. And that's how when you load the edit form, it should actually be 100% functional. So let's test that out really quick to verify if the theory is right or if we need anything else. So let's refresh this, click on edit node, and there we go. It's loading the editing node template, and then when it loads it using an Ajax request, as you can see right here, it loads it and then it renders it into the form input values. And for our final action, we need to be able to save changes. And to do that, that's actually also just as simple. It's just a matter of listening to the node edit forms on submit method and call the onEdit submit function, which is also quite simple. It looks a bit like this. It's very similar to the function we had previously for creation of new elements. And inside of it, it's going to have the usual event.prevent default. Then I'm going to create a new node object using basically the information for the node in this situation. I do notice I have some dead code, by the way. So that author definitely looks like some junk I shouldn't have anymore. So let's just delete that. That's not needed. And once I have my new node object, I call my HTTP method and my HTTP module called update node. So it's this one. So here's update node. I pass in everything because this one's quite of a complex one. So we need to receive the node ID it wants to update, the new node object it's going to update, the JSON web token because it's a protected endpoint, and the on success and on error. So we can show a helpful feedback if something goes wrong or goes well. So if it's successful, it's going to say node changes saved successfully, redirecting, and it redirects you to the node details HTML with the ID. And if it's not, it just gives you an alert saying there was a problem. If we save that, we should have a fully finished front end. So let's test that from node 2 to node 22 and another content 22.2. Save changes, no changes saved successfully, and we're done. We're pretty much done. That's a fully functional front end. So we went a bit overboard, so excuse me with the timing. It's the first time I give this workshop topic, so it's quite of a challenging one, to be honest. But yeah, if it was a bit too fast, a bit too quick, you can always find the code on GitHub, on my Just Jotted repository. And basically, the takeaway here, the biggest takeaway I think you should have appreciated or noticed here, is that thanks to modularization, our pages end up looking very, very clean and very small. So none of my components really barely go over the 50 lines of code. So they are very small, very clean, very lean, and very easy to maintain because everything is just so well modularized. And also because of functional programming patterns, we use very little globals. So we only use globals for our modules and for our states, and that's it. And the globals are only altered in very obvious ways, but not inside of functions. So yeah, I think that wraps up pretty much the function. I'm going to stop the recording right here. Give me a sec.